Imagine discovering that one man secretly owned a country the size of Western Europe. Not ruled it, not governed it, but owned it, just like you own a car, or a house, or a pair of shoes. He was a quiet, awkward European king no one took seriously, and his name was King Leopold II of Belgium. Belgium itself was a young country, barely more than 30 years old, carved out of older European powers as a political compromise. It was small, neutral, and deliberately unambitious. Its kings were expected to smile politely, attend ceremonies, and avoid causing trouble. Leopold inherited exactly that kind of throne when he became king in 1865. To Leopold, this was almost an insult. He had grown up watching Europe's great empires stretch across the globe. Britain ruled India, France was expanding across Africa, and even the Netherlands, a country not much larger than Belgium, controlled enormous overseas territories. Belgium, meanwhile, had no empire at all, no colonies, no prestige, no global weight. Leopold did not see this as a national problem. He saw it as a personal one. From an early age, he believed that greatness was something a king was owed, not something that had to be negotiated with parliaments or voters. Belgium's constitutional system frustrated him endlessly. The government controlled the money, the military, and foreign policy, while the king was expected to nod along. Leopold wanted more than symbolism. He wanted scale, he wanted legacy. And if Belgium refused to build an empire, then Leopold would simply build one without it. This decision would quietly reshape millions of lives, even though, at the time, it barely raised an eyebrow. Leopold was not reckless or impulsive. He understood that openly declaring colonial ambitions would fail immediately. Belgium's politicians had no interest in expensive overseas experiments, and the public had little appetite for them either. So Leopold chose a different approach. He began presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian. During the 1870s, Europe was gripped by a fascination with exploration. Large parts of Africa were still poorly mapped by Europeans, and expeditions were celebrated like heroic adventures. Leopold leaned into this enthusiasm. He attended geography conferences, hosted lavish receptions for explorers, and spoke passionately about science, progress, and the moral duty of Europe to end the Arab slave trade in Africa. To many listeners, he sounded enlightened, benevolent even. What they did not realize was that Leopold was not talking about colonies for Belgium. He was laying the groundwork for something far more unusual, a colony that would belong to him alone. At the center of his attention was the Congo Basin, a region so vast that most Europeans could barely comprehend its size. Dense rainforests, immense rivers, and countless communities lived there, largely untouched by European control. To Leopold, it represented the perfect opportunity, distant, poorly understood, and most importantly unclaimed by any major European power. The problem was that Leopold had never set foot there, nor did he have any real means of reaching it, so he found someone who could. That man was Henry Morton Stanley, one of the most famous explorers of the age. Stanley had already captured public imagination by finding the missionary David Livingstone, and then navigating the Congo River from coast to interior, a journey many believed impossible. Leopold courted Stanley carefully. He praised his bravery, funded his expeditions, and offered him something few others could: unlimited backing with almost no questions asked. Stanley, who was deeply ambitious and not particularly concerned with the moral implications of his work, accepted. What followed was not exploration in the romantic sense, but paperwork, treaties, signatures, and marks placed on documents by local leaders who had no concept of European property law. Stanley presented these agreements as mutual partnerships, but in reality, many chiefs believed they were granting temporary access or protection, not surrendering land forever. Legally speaking, it was the equivalent of tricking someone into signing away their house by claiming it was a guest book. Perfectly valid on paper, deeply fraudulent in practice. By the time European governments began paying attention, Leopold had already assembled a staggering claim. Through a web of shell organizations with names like the International African Association, he controlled a territory roughly 76 times the size of Belgium. And here's the crucial detail. This land did not belong to Belgium. It belonged to Leopold. If stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe. There's a lot more coming. Now, back to the Congo. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, a gathering where European powers carved Africa into spheres of influence, Leopold achieved what might be the greatest diplomatic con of the century. He convinced the other nations that his new domain, the so-called Congo Free State, would be a neutral humanitarian project dedicated to free trade, scientific research, and the abolition of slavery. They agreed. Just like that, Leopold II became the personal sovereign of an enormous African territory, recognised by the world's most powerful empires. No Belgian parliament had approved it. No Belgian voter had been consulted. Even the Belgian government barely understood what had just happened. It was as if a man had shown up to a family dinner and calmly announced that he now owned your childhood home, the street it was on, and the people living inside it, and everyone else at the table nodded and moved on. And this was only the beginning. At first, the Congo Free State did not look like a nightmare. There were no mass killings, no global outrage, no headlines. Leopold ruled from Europe, never visiting the land he now controlled. Administrators were sent, outposts were built, trade began flowing. But beneath the surface, the system Leopold designed was not meant to coexist with the people of the Congo. It was meant to extract from them, and soon, the world would discover what happens when a single man is allowed to own an entire country and treat its population as nothing more than a means to an end. Then the world discovered rubber. In the late 19th century, industrialization was accelerating at a furious pace. Bicycles became fashionable, then automobiles followed, and suddenly rubber was no longer a curiosity. It was essential. Tires, hoses, insulation, machinery belts. The modern world was hungry for it, and prices skyrocketed. The Congo, inconveniently for its people and conveniently for Leopold, was rich in wild rubber vines. This was the moment the Congo Free State stopped being an idea and became a machine. Leopold reorganized his colony with a single objective: extraction at scale. Land was declared state property, which in practice meant Leopold's property. Villages that had lived off farming, fishing, and local trade for generations were now surrounded by forests redefined as concessions. The people living there were informed, often through translators or armed intermediaries, that they were now required to collect rubber for the state. There were no wages worth mentioning. Payment usually came in the form of vague promises of protection, or simply the absence of punishment. To enforce this system, Leopold created a colonial army known as the Force Publique. It was led by European officers and staffed largely by African soldiers recruited or coerced from far outside the regions they were sent to control. This separation was intentional. It reduced sympathy and increased obedience. Orders were simple. Quotas must be met. Rubber was not harvested like crops. It required long, exhausting journeys into dense jungle, cutting vines, and waiting for latex to drip into containers. It was slow, physically punishing work, and the quotas were often impossible. When villages failed to deliver, punishment followed. At first, these punishments were presented as discipline. Hostages were taken, usually women or children, and held until the men returned with rubber. Homes were burned to make an example. Food supplies were destroyed, ensuring that resistance meant starvation. Over time, violence became routine rather than exceptional. One of the most infamous practices involved the severing of hands. Soldiers were required to account for their ammunition, and to prove that bullets had not been wasted on hunting or rebellion, they were ordered to present the severed right hand of someone they had killed. In theory, this was meant to prevent unnecessary killing. In reality, it produced something far worse. Hands became currency. They were cut from the dead, from the dying, and sometimes from the living when killing was inconvenient. Entire baskets of them were delivered to officers as proof of work completed. The logic of the system made cruelty not just tolerated, but efficient. This was not a breakdown of control. It was control functioning exactly as designed. What makes this period particularly chilling is how administrative it all was. Reports were written, numbers were recorded, quotas were adjusted. From Leopold's perspective in Europe, rubber production graphs were rising beautifully, and his personal wealth was growing just as quickly. By the turn of the century, Leopold was one of the richest men in Europe. He poured his profits into grand construction projects in Belgium, monumental buildings, wide boulevards, lavish estates. To the average Belgian citizen, this looked like national progress. The source of the money was rarely discussed. Leopold himself cultivated the image of a responsible ruler. He funded charities, supported scientific institutions, and continued presenting the Congo as a moral enterprise. Publicly, he insisted that reports of abuse were exaggerated, or the result of isolated misconduct by rogue officials. Privately, he ignored warning signs with remarkable consistency. Missionaries working in the Congo began sending letters home describing what they saw: depopulated villages, scarred survivors, entire regions emptied of people. Some compared the labour demands to slavery in all but name. A few even suggested that the death toll was catastrophic. Leopold dismissed them as troublemakers. What he never acknowledged was that the system left no room for mercy. And yet for years this remained largely invisible to the wider world. Europe preferred the myth. It was easier to believe in a philanthropic king bringing order to Africa than to confront the reality that one man's private business venture was destroying millions of lives. Leopold had wrapped his empire in the language of progress so thoroughly that questioning it felt almost impolite. But silence does not last forever. By the early 1900s, the evidence had grown too large to ignore. Photographs began circulating, testimonies reached newspapers. A small but determined group of critics started asking an uncomfortable question: how could a free state require so much violence to function? And once that question was asked, the story of the Congo and Leopold himself began to unravel. Then the reports reached a man named Edmund Dean Morel. Morel was not a missionary or a politician. He was a shipping clerk working for a British trading company. His job was dull and methodical, which is precisely why he noticed something strange. Ships travelling from Belgium to the Congo were loaded with guns, ammunition and chains. Ships returning to Europe were filled with rubber and ivory. What they were not filled with was trade goods. No textiles, no manufactured products, nothing that suggested a functioning economy. To Morel, this meant only one thing: the Congo was not trading. It was being stripped. Morel began writing, publishing, and speaking obsessively. He compared shipping manifests, collected testimonies, and built a case that was impossible to dismiss as emotional exaggeration. His argument was simple and devastating. A system that exports enormous wealth and imports only weapons is not commerce. It is coercion. And coercion on that scale leaves bodies behind. Leopold responded the way powerful men often do when confronted with uncomfortable truths. He denied, deflected, and delayed. He hired public relations firms before the term even existed. He paid journalists to write favourable articles. He accused critics of being agents of rival colonial powers, jealous of his success. When necessary, he expressed polite concern while insisting that any abuses were isolated incidents already being addressed. Behind the scenes, nothing changed. What Leopold did not anticipate was how the narrative had shifted. This was no longer a debate about administration. It was a moral question, and moral questions spread faster than official denials. In Britain, public meetings were held. In the United States, senators discussed the Congo on the floor of Congress. Writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle joined the criticism, using satire and documentation to expose the absurdity of Leopold's claims. Twain in particular mocked Leopold's humanitarian language so mercilessly that it became impossible to read official statements without hearing the hypocrisy echo underneath. Leopold's defenders argued that Africa was chaotic, that discipline was necessary, that Europeans could not be judged by European standards when ruling uncivilized peoples. But even by the deeply racist norms of the time, the Congo stood out. The numbers alone were staggering. Although precise figures are impossible to determine, historians estimate that the population of the Congo may have been reduced by millions during Leopold's rule, through a combination of murder, starvation, disease, and collapsing birth rates. Entire regions were emptied. Social structures disintegrated, trauma became generational. This was no longer something that could be explained away as mismanagement. It was systemic. By the early 1900s, international pressure had reached a level Leopold could not ignore. Investigations were launched. Official commissions were sent to the Congo. Their findings, while cautiously worded, confirmed the worst accusations. Leopold fought back desperately. He stalled. He negotiated. He attempted to water down reports and limit their circulation, but the illusion of benevolent ownership was gone. In 1908, after more than 2 decades of personal rule, Leopold was forced to surrender the Congo Free State. It became a Belgian colony, taken over by the state he had once bypassed entirely. On paper, This marked the end of one of the most extreme examples of private imperialism in history. In reality, it changed far less than many hoped. The system softened. The worst excesses were reduced, but the foundations remained. Extraction continued. Control remained centralized. The Congolese people were not liberated, they were simply transferred from one master to another. Leopold, meanwhile, faced no trial, no exile, no reckoning. He died the following year, in 1909, immensely wealthy and deeply unpopular. Crowds reportedly booed his funeral procession, a rare and telling gesture in a country not known for public outrage against its monarchs. He left behind no confession and no apology, only the insistence that his intentions had been misunderstood. In Belgium, the money he extracted remained visible in stone and marble. Grand buildings and wide boulevards stood as silent witnesses to a fortune whose origins were rarely discussed. For decades, the Congo was framed as a colonial project gone wrong, not as what it truly was, a country privately owned and systematically drained. In the Congo, the damage was far harder to erase. Communities had been broken, populations reduced, and systems of extraction normalized. When independence finally came in 1960, it arrived without the stability or institutions that might have existed had the country not first been treated as one man's possession. Leopold did not seize the Congo in secret. He acquired it in public, through agreements the world accepted because they were convenient, and for years that acceptance was all he needed.